So next we're going to move, we've been talking again about the what of being a supervisor. Next we're going to talk about sort of the how, which is the work styles portion. So you've gone over what the responsibilities are, these 7 responsibilities. You've done a bit of a self-assessment, but now we're going to think about really the how of how you do it is your work styles and your preferences. So how you prefer to get things done, which also tends to be how you would prefer other people to get things done too. So it's important to know your preferences. And so when you're thinking about work style preferences, and you should have saw that was also on that tell no list around baseline assessment. So that should hopefully going through this exercise will help with that as well. But if you're thinking about work style preferences, how you do your best work, think about this is true for all of us, obviously all of us on this Zoom meeting, but everybody in the world. We all have behaviors, strategies, beliefs, and values that we think are the basis of our success, our safety, and our sense of order in the world. And so it's really important to be in thinking about that, and that everybody has different behavior, strategies, beliefs, and values that lead them to what they think makes them successful. To be curious and open about other people's approaches, to be evidence-based and fair in your assessment. Again, being hard on the problem and not hard on the person, really just thinking about what the issue is at work, not sort of who they are as a human being, and being flexible and transparent in your responses. And today I'm going to go over 3 categories and different language for how to talk about work styles. There's a lot of different ways to talk about work styles. We're just giving you the framework that has worked well for our workshop series. But the most important thing is to have non-pathologizing language around work style preferences, which is just non-pathologizing language around our differences. So we have a way to talk about it, be transparent about it, and communicate to work better together. So I'm going to talk about the 3 categories of how one feels organized, thinks and communicates, and learns and teaches. So again, going back to the tell no list, sort of the setting expectations and baseline assessment. When you're bringing someone new on, there should be a period of time in which you're assessing how do they optimally learn new information, how do they communicate, make decisions, organize themselves, handle conflict and change. But first, we're going to go through an assessment of yourself for the period. We're going to spend some time having you do a quick assessment so that hopefully if you do assessment of yourself, it'll make it easier to assess others going forward. So this takes us to activity 3A. So as you're scrolling down through that series of lists of things we want you to check out and fill in, this is down towards page 5. It might be a little further now, depending on how you filled out your onboarding map. But the idea is I'm going to go again, kind of explain these dichotomies of different ways of feeling organized, thinking, communicating, and learning. And you're just going to mark your preferences so that you have sort of a list at the end of a sense of like how you could talk about your work styles and also in reflection of other people's. All right, so we'll get started. So again, this is activity 3A, about page 5 on the worksheet and resources Google Doc. So the first dichotomy we talk about is early starter versus pressure prompted and how people feel organized. If you are an early starter, generally starting early gives you a sense that you have time to make things right, to do your best work. Or if you're pressure prompted, your thoughts may crystallize as you get closer to the due date. And so as you think it for a second, kind of, are you closer to being an early starter? So do you want to start a project significantly ahead of time? Or do you you prefer like, it's going to be the best work you can do when you do it right before it's due? And I'm going to pause a second in this one and talk a little bit more about it because it is one that people really tend to pathologize a lot, the difference between early starters and pressure prompted. This is really just a spectrum where early starters, sometimes they're labeled as being anxious or control freaks, and pressure prompted people are labeled as being lazy or irresponsible or slackers. But really these individuals, this is how they do their best work. If you take someone who is an early starter and force them to work right close to the due date, they probably are not going to do their best work. And that is also the same for someone who's pressure prompted. If you're like, hey, start doing this months ahead of time or weeks ahead of time, they may be pressured to start working on that, but they will still probably not do their best work until right by the deadline. And again, that's because of experiences and success for themselves that they have had repeatedly throughout their experiences for their own lifetime and how they work best. So yeah, we'll move on to the next one. So take a second and think about being an early starter versus being pressure prompted and which one you're closer to. Is this a strong preference one way or the other, neutral? So yeah, just choose one. It's just a reminder. Okay, another way of feeling organized is to think about the difference between being structured or free form. So if you're structured and you're starting a new project, you're probably thinking about, hey, let's look at the calendar now, pick some dates to meet. Our first meeting, we can assign roles, determine tasks, how we'll track things, versus someone who's more free form. Let's agree to meet, maybe next week-ish. We don't need to figure everything out right now. So just take a second and think about whether you're more structured or more free form, and mark that on the assessment sheet. The next one is starting to move into how one thinks and communicates is an internal processor versus an external processor. So if you're an internal processor and I ask you something like, what was the greatest discovery of the 21st century? You're probably going to want to stop, organize your thoughts before you start talking. Where an external processor might immediately start talking and kind of feel like their ideas and decisions will emerge as they speak. This is another one where this is really just two different preferences and how different dichotomies in how people think and communicate, but leads to a lot of pathologizing right off the bat. So often internal processors, people might consider them unconfident or not willing to take an initiative, because when they're asked a question, they don't kind of immediately have a speedy answer ready for it, versus someone who's very much an external processor, might be considered a chatty Cathy, someone who talks too much, who's overconfident or needy, because they always are needing to talk to somebody. So take a second and think, are you more an internal processor or an external processor? And if you have any questions, if you could put them in chat, that would be great. Another way of thinking and communicating is systematic versus organic or richly associative. So if you're systematic, you might say they're probably likely to walk you through each step so that you have a thorough understanding of what happened. At best, it's really organized. At worst, it's a slog. So if you ask somebody, why is the photocopier jammed? And they're like, well, I got to work today at 8:30 and I came upstairs and I opened the door to the photocopier machine and someone was there and I waited 10 minutes for them to finish. And then I started copying, right? And they're kind of going through a bunch of details that maybe you don't feel is needed. Versus organic or richly associative, where it's all connected and it comes together at the end. So the way they communicate and think, at best, it's really dynamic and on point, kind of gets to the point of why there's a jam in the photocopier. But at worst, sometimes it can be a confusing brain dump. So you're not exactly sure where they're going with the information. But again, just two different ways of thinking and communicating, which both have positives and potential negatives. Okay, so take a second, think about, are you more systematic or more organic or richly associative? And we'll move on to the last piece of thinking and communicating. So if you look at this picture here, kind of what do you see? The difference between being, we'll talk about the difference between being a concrete or an abstract thinker and communicator. So if you're concrete and you see this, you might say, I see 12 bubbles. 1 is large, 6 are medium-sized, 5 are small. You're really relying on the facts. Versus if you're a more abstract thinker and communicator, you might say something more like bubbles. It's like a solar system of planets around an unseen sun. You're really pushing on analogies and similes in how you communicate and think. So take a second and think about that dichotomy and where you might fit on that spectrum. And I realize I have like 2 minutes left, so we're gonna go through learning and teaching, and then we'll stick around to answer any questions you have. So learning is actually a really important component of this, because if you're taking on somebody, obviously you are going to be doing some teaching and training. And the way that you enjoy learning almost always equals the way you teach others. Just because you think that works best for you, you tend to get materials and resources and teach and train people that way. So thinking about what is the way that you most like to learn. If, for instance, I said you needed to learn to change a tire, what would be your preferred way to learn that? Would you be a visual learner? Let me watch you do it. An oral learner? Talk me through it first. Reading and writing? Kind of, is there a manual? Great, I'll get back to you. I'll read it and come back to you. Or a kinesthetic learner? Hey, just step aside and let me figure it out. And try it, play it around with it. So again, important to, there's a second stage to this learning one. It's on the next slide. And you just want to kind of think, the most important thing here, especially as we're short on time, but thinking about like, which is the one that is your most preference for learning, and which one is your least preference. People can learn in multiple different ways, but you will learn more effectively usually if you are given resources or taught in a particular way that's most in alignment with what your learning preference is. And so the real importance here is thinking that, again, if the way you like to learn the most is also the way that you'll most likely teach, that's great if the student employee you have also learns that way really effectively. But if they don't, and they're the opposite, you're going to want to know that so that you don't spend a bunch of time giving them resources and teaching and training them in a way that's actually not effective for them to learn, or maybe not as effective as other ways you could. I realize we're running up to time, so I completely understand if people need to drop off, but we'll finish up the presentation and wait for questions at the end if you have them. So just being aware of that. Thank you to those who can stay on. So I just wanted to say one more thing, a couple of things around this learning and teaching part, is that it's, even at this space, it's important and it's a potential place to continue to make the workplace more inclusive. So from the get-go at the hiring stage, you can start introducing things like this. So you could say in the interview, if you're the selected candidate, I'll be responsible for training you. How do you think you best learn information? So you're building already part of that know, right? Understanding their work styles even before they come into the workplace. And on top of sort of talking about all the different work style preferences, know that there are people who are internal processors who it may take them a while to get back to you as to what their best learning style is. And if that happens, you can also be like, hey, that's okay. Just know if you're hired, I'll ask again because I'm committed to your training. And so wrapping all of these pieces in and thinking about work styles and learning styles really can help fulfill all these tenets of inclusivity, right? Making sure people see themselves as being valued, they can bring their authentic self to work. You're being transparent, hopefully, about your own work styles and putting in checks and balances to hold in any biases you might have because of how you like to work and how you like to learn. And when you do that, you're really building psychological safety and trust for your student employee. So kind of breaking it down overall, you saw a similar flow through for this previously. We went through the 7 responsibilities, then we kind of broke down gave you a chance to think about assessing your skill level for those different responsibilities. I just want to let you know, whatever you thought you were least skillful at, we're around. We would actually really love to have conversations with people about it, but know that at the bottom of that worksheet, there's a ton of resources specifically for each of these responsibilities. So you could go in and start reading some of the materials around that, if that to help build those skills if you want to. Then we took these 7 responsibilities and we took one, the kind of the first predominant one around setting expectations and setting baseline, and walked you through a way that you could, using this tell no list, that you could address that. And then sort of more specifically, how could you address work responsibilities and start to get an understanding of work style for yourself and for your student employee. And again, all of this being really transparent and accountable and thinking critically about these things kind of allows you to really operationalize inclusivity in your supervisory role.